So this is what we're making, a wide domed patterned ring. Now this is 16 millimeters wide, which is a bit wide. So if I were to redo it, I would probably do it 13 millimeters. I think it would make a little bit nicer. But up to you, sky's the limit. It's just a good basic ring, and I expect you to make it your own. The material I'm using is 16 millimeters wide and 0.7 thick. Now, get your ring size. You can use an existing ring if you want. Measure the inside diameter. Add the thickness of the material multiplied by 3.14. Now, when you get that answer, you need to add either 3 or 4 millimeters because we're going to make it into a dome, and when we dome it, it's actually going to get smaller. So when you've cut your piece to the proper length, don't bother filing the ends perfectly flat at this point because we're going to put a pattern on it, and when we put a pattern on, it will probably damage the end a bit, so we'll just wait to file that until after we put the pattern on. Now, you'll need to anneal the metal before you put the pattern on, and then you'll need to anneal it again after you put the pattern on because you will have work hardened it. If you've ordered your metal half hard or dead soft, then you don't have to anneal it the first time, but you do have to anneal it before you try to bend it after you've put the pattern on. So I'm going to cut this to length and then anneal it. So my measurement is 62 millimeters, and I'm going to add 3 millimeters to compensate for the dome. So I'm cutting to 65 millimeters. So to anneal, we're just going to heat this up until it's a dull red. It doesn't matter which torch you use, as long as you bring it up to a dull red. It doesn't need to be any brighter than that. And then quench it. And we just quench in water. And dry. So I'm just using a shiny steel block on my lap and my jeweler's hammer, which has kind of a chisel tip. It's a cross peen. So I'm just going to put a herringbone pattern in. And then just turn it. It can be a bit random, it doesn't matter, as long as you have a pattern. And it could be letters, could be numbers, could be anything you want. Now, at this point, we need to file these ends perfectly flat, and I just use a Swiss No. 2 cut flat hand file, and I brace it against my bench pin and file this way. Concentrate to make sure you keep your file flat, because if you let it do this, it's going to round it off. Oftentimes when we start to push, we'll push down on this end, and then we try to bring it up level, and then we go over the other end. So just try to keep it as flat as possible. And you can use the smooth side of your file to check to make sure that it is flat. So you'll be able to see whether it is or isn't. Now, at this point, if you put a heavy pattern on, you'll need to anneal it again. You can try using your flat half-round pliers, half-round on the inside, and if it forms easily, form it. If it doesn't, anneal it. And you don't have to straighten it out to anneal it. You can anneal any shape. So this is a little bit work hardened, so I'll go ahead and anneal it again. So I annealed it, quenched it, and always dry the metal before you start working it again, otherwise you'll make your tools rusty. Now you want to bring these edges as close together as you can. You want this to be as perfect as possible, because otherwise you're going to lose a lot of the detail of the ring when you start sanding, and we don't want to do that. We want sanding to be minimal. We want to make sure that the ring isn't twisted so that the edges line up nice and straight. So take your time, get this as nice as possible. And for the metal to solder, it has to touch. If there's the tiniest gap, it won't solder. And you cannot fill a gap with solder unless you're soldering gold. One of the little tricks is you can take your parallel jaw pliers and put it across the seam and just give it a bit of a squeeze. And sometimes, if it's slightly imperfect, that'll straighten it up. But oftentimes it's just a matter of using your fingers. And get it as level as possible. We don't want the ends to be off one way or the other, or once again you'll lose a lot of the ring when you're trying to sand that out. Yes, it will solder, but it won't be pretty. So I have the ring in my third hand. We're going to flex the inside. And I'm not going to flex the outside because I don't want a lot of solder to go out there. I want it to stay pretty much on the inside. So stir up your flux, always stir up your flux. And I think 2 pieces of hard solder about 2 millimeters long. And place it with your flux brush. And we're just going to lay it right on that seam. So fire up your torch. Once again, it doesn't really matter which torch you're using. I'm using a mini torch, a Smith's mini torch. So I'm just going to warm this up, because I want to dry out the flux and then push the solder so that I have it exactly where I want it. And you have to keep the flux warm, otherwise you can't push it around. So I'm about 60 millimeters away and I'm just circling. And you'll see the flux go clear, and then the solder will flow. So it flowed here, and I switched the flame to the other end just to make sure that the solder goes down there. And we'll quench. And have a look, and it should be just a fine solder line on the outside, and you should be able to see it. The solder should have flown all the way through. So now we're going to pickle, and I just use sodium bisulfate, which is used to lower the pH in the swimming pool, and I use it cold in a Tupperware bowl. So this is 25 grams of powder per liter of water is the mix I use. I'll come out of the pickle and use copper tweezers to put things in and out of the pickle. If you use steel, it will copper plate your materials, and that's not very much fun. So, ring mandrel, rawhide hammer, and you can just push this down and then round it up. Flip it over to make sure that you don't have a long taper in it. And you can look at the end of your ring mandrel with the ring on there, and you can see whether you have it round or not. If it's not round, you'll have a gap, an air gap. So now, opposite the join, we're going to hallmark it. And now we're going to use 400 grade sandpaper, wet or dry, on a sanding stick. And we're just going to tidy up the join. And if you got it so that it was lined up correctly, it won't take much sanding to tidy it up. We want to completely disappear the solder. Which I've done, and you'll see that I've blanked out part of the pattern. Well, what you do is you just put this back on your ring mandrel, use the hammer or whatever you use to make the pattern, and then you go back over it. So now our solder line is completely disappeared and our pattern is back on. Now you can see that the edge doesn't quite line up on this side, so we're just going to take a sheet of sandpaper, put it on the bench, and sand it. Do both sides. Sorry about the noise. Anyway, do both sides until you have a nice dull finish all the way around and no visible step where the two pieces of metal come together. Now, I'm going to form this using the doming block. And what you want is the dome to be fairly close to the size of your ring. And I'm going to just hold my chasing hammer on top and then hit it with my rawhide hammer. I don't want to damage the ball on the chasing hammer. So turn it over, do the other side. And just go back and forth, and what you need to do is make sure that it fits you. So when you get it to the size where it fits, stop. And you can see that this is a fairly low dome. If you wanted a higher dome, we'd probably go into a bigger ball so that it could spread out a little bit, rather than confining it to just the curve. So now it's a matter of just sanding the inside of this, because you'll have a slightly rough inside because of the way it's formed. So just take your split mandrel and whiz it around until it's nice and smooth so that your fingers like it. You could take a piece of sandpaper and just run it around with your finger. Oh, the split mandrel is just a piece of steel that has a slice in it, so you can put sandpaper in. So what we're going to do now is polish this up, and then our ring is finished. Now you can just use a small buff on your handpiece, or you can use a polishing motor. And the polishing motor you don't have to spend a fortune for. You can just get a grinder from your automotive shop and put a tapered adapter on it so that you can put a wheel on. So you can see it's quite easy to do this by hand. So that's our shiny, shiny ring. So there it is, all nice and shiny. A wide domed patterned ring.